Death Knight is once again shaping up to be one of the best DPS specs in Mythic Plus. Based on the current Season 2 PTR performance, without any changes, DPS Death Knight will have sat at the top of the Mythic Plus food chain for 5 seasons in a row. 5 whole seasons. That is over 2 years of dominance in WoW's most popular endgame activity. Today, I wanted to talk about why this is becoming a real problem. The easy answer is to say that Blizzard just keeps missing the mark with damage tuning. It does too much damage, Blizzard is too slow to nerf it, and somehow it ends up being the king of Mythic Plus again. But that isn't the full story. The real problem is that Death Knight is not just strong, it is the most complete Mythic Plus spec in the game by far. Alongside its damage, it brings survivability, utility, grips, massive defensive value, a toolkit that seems almost perfectly designed for modern Mythic Plus dungeons. So let's take a look at how Death Knight has managed to stay on top of the Mythic Plus food chain for this long, why normal damage tuning is probably not even going to fix this, and why, unless something drastic changes, it is going to continue being the best spec in Mythic Plus every single season for the foreseeable future. Now, you might hear all of that and think that I'm exaggerating, but Death Knight's dominance in Mythic Plus really can't be overstated. As of the time of recording, 98 of the top 100 Mythic Plus runs in the current season contain a DPS Death Knight. By the end of War Within Season 3, that number was 90 of the top 100. In Season 2 of War Within, it was 74 of the top 100. And Season 1 of War Within is the only one where DK wasn't completely everywhere, but even still, it appeared in 18 of the top 100 global runs at the time. This has become a noticeable pattern. Hell, at this rate with the increases season to season, next season may see a 100% representation of DPS DK. This graph from Jordan, Lore of Statistics on X, breaks it down really nicely as well. This shows the top 1,000 runs of Mythic Plus in each of the last 4 seasons. As you can see, Death Knight makes up a massive portion of all of the highest level Mythic Plus runs. And this doesn't really include Blood Death Knight at all. There have been a few Blood runs here and there depending on the season, but by and large, the red on this graph is entirely made up of Frost and Unholy Death Knight. Other specs will get their moment, get nerfed, and then disappear again. But over the last 2 years, no class has consistently dominated Mythic Plus DPS quite like Death Knight. Now, the obvious place to look to see why this is happening is damage. Honestly, if you do look purely at logs, you might think that this is just the definitive reason. Over the last few seasons, either Frost or Unholy has consistently been one of the highest damage specs in Mythic Plus. This season, Unholy is sitting in second, behind only Augmentation of Ochre. Last season, it was firmly at the top of the leaderboard, and in Season 2 of War Within, it was effectively tied with Arcane Mage and Balance Druid for first, but with all 3 of them sitting miles in front of the rest of the pack. So, case closed, right? Death Knight is meta because Death Knight just does more damage than everyone else? Not exactly. If you take a closer look at even this season's graph, Elemental Shaman is only about 1% behind Unholy Death Knight. But once you account for the Sky Fury buff giving extra mastery and auto attack damage, Elemental would likely overtake DK in total group output. The same logic applies for Frost Mage and Arcane Mage. Arcane Intellect alone is enough to compensate for the small gap in personal DPS, meaning that from a pure damage perspective, Mage should be right up there with Death Knight. But how many mages do we actually see in title cutoff? As of a few weeks ago, the answer was 5. Across the whole world, compared to 450 Death Knights. Even in the 1% bracket, the discrepancy was massive. 196 mages compared to 3,649 Death Knights. So if mages equal to DK in damage, or potentially even a little bit better when you account for the group buff, why is the representation so wide apart? That's where the damage argument sort of loses its teeth a little. Damage does matter. A spec really won't be at the top of the leaderboards if it doesn't do enough damage to stay there. But Death Knight's position in the Mythic Plus meta is not just a damage tuning issue. Honestly, I genuinely believe that unless DK does literally 25% less damage than the top spec, which won't happen anyway because the gap is never that large, it will always be the best Mythic Plus DPS regardless. In reality, post-Dragonflight Death Knight has an almost perfectly built kit for Mythic Plus. The class is so insanely tanky that even in a lot of high keys, it can almost be ignored by the healer. Between Icebound Fortitude, Lichborn, extremely high passive health, just general tankiness from being a plate wearer, and the ability to death strike back massive chunks of health. Healing checks with a DK are genuinely easier because one of your DPS pretty much just doesn't require any attention. Then you add anti-magic shell on top of that. On paper, AMS is just already a strong short cooldown defensive against magic damage, but in practice, it also completely cheeses a ridiculous amount of mechanics. Any magic dots or debuffs or certain targeted abilities that would normally require you to actually handle them can just be 100% ignored. Then there are grips. Any pull where a caster is spread away from the main pack, which is a lot of pulls, becomes dramatically easier because the Death Knight can just yoink that caster into the group. This makes it much cleaner for tanks to gather, and it also makes the damage output of the group better because everything is nice and clustered very quickly. And if all of that wasn't enough, Death Knight also has AMZ, which is an extremely strong party defensive that can mitigate a huge portion of group-wide damage every 3 minutes. This is where I think damage is almost irrelevant, because this season, outside of Elgathar Academy, the bottleneck in high keys has not really been the timer. We are seeing some of the highest keys in the world, like say 23 seat, being timed with multiple minutes to spare. The real bottleneck is just being able to stay alive. That's where Death Knight becomes nearly impossible to replace. Not only does it have its own unparalleled ability to survive, but it also needs such a small amount of healer attention that the healer can then dedicate that extra attention and resources to the rest of the party. So Death Knight doesn't end up just being tankier itself, it indirectly makes the rest of the group tankier as well. Now, when Blizzard are confronted with tuning problems, they have had a bad habit of approaching things in what is probably the most obvious way. Most of the time, they'll just nerf the strength of whatever is too strong. To be fair, that makes sense on some level. If something's too good, make it less good. But I don't think that actually addresses the problem, especially when it comes to Death Knight. Because the issue isn't that Death Knight does too much damage, the issue is that Death Knight has too many answers to too many problems in Mythic Plus, and a lot of other specs simply don't have those. Going forward, I think there are two things that Blizzard needs to do. Firstly, they need to be more active in tuning classes specifically around Mythic Plus. I know this sounds like I'm fanboying over the game mode a little bit, but Mythic Plus is WoW's most popular endgame activity. A massive portion of the player base engages with it, and yet Blizzard seems far more interested in tuning specs around raid performance than Mythic Plus performance. Death Knight has benefited a lot from this. When specs like Unholy get single target buffs for raid, those changes translate into enormous AoE gains in Mythic Plus simply due to the spec's design. Balance Druid has historically had similar issues. Whenever even a small raid buff comes in, it will suddenly be doing huge amounts of AoE damage just simply due to how the spec is designed. On the other side, you have specs like Windwalker Monk and Devastation Evoker, which can end up feeling like they're almost doomed in Mythic Plus, because if their damage was pushed up to be high enough to compete in keys, they would be completely absurd in raid. So I do understand that this isn't an easy problem to solve. Realistically, some of it probably requires some deeper class design changes, but at the very least, Blizzard needs to pay much closer attention to how specs are actually performing in Mythic Plus. Not just in their overall damage output, but also their representation, survivability, the utility that the specs have, and what classes are being brought and why they're being brought into specific dungeons. The main issue isn't having strong specs. Strong specs are cool. The issue is when one spec has a monopoly on too many useful tools at once, which leads me nicely to the second point. Instead of constantly taking away things that make certain specs powerful, Blizzard should look to give more specs the ability to perform in similar niches. Death Knights are insanely tanky melee DPS. Cool, that's part of their identity. Why can't Warrior lean further into that role? Say by broadening spell reflex interactions and giving the defensive capabilities a little bit more power. Why can't Mage and Warlock have a unique way to remove or prevent certain magic effects? Maybe even ones that are not dispellable by other normal dispels. Why couldn't Rogue have a poison that gives them an insanely high amount of leech and allows them to be much more self-sufficient against heavy rot damage? Why couldn't certain defensives prevent specific debuffs from being applied in the first place? Maybe Obsidian Scales could stop bleed applications. Maybe Windwalker Monk could have some form of grip or displacement that is similar to Death Knight's grip. I'm not saying that any of these ideas are perfect. Honestly, there's probably a heap of better ones. If you have any, let me know in the comments. But the broad point is that Blizzard should be giving specs more tools to handle mechanics, not allowing one class to hoard them all before inevitably nerfing them into the ground. Because being able to independently solve mechanics is cool. Class identity is cool. Having unique strengths is cool. What is not cool is when one class owns a monopoly on all of those at once. That's my take anyway. Death Knight being strong isn't a problem. Death Knight being the answer to almost every Mythic Plus problem, season after season, absolutely is. A huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel, including the Joy of Checks, Tobias, Yulem, Is This Real, and Obold the Orc at the Keystone Legend tier, as well as everyone else appearing on the end screen. If you want to support the channel or get some direct help with your own gameplay, check out the links in the description below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all in Azeroth, gamers. Until next time, take care.